Hello everybody, Mobius Y here with another video for Stellaris Console Edition. So this video is the last tier list video that I want to do before we get Update 2.2 later on Console Edition. Whenever that comes out, I'm sure I'll be revising this tier list and the other ones that I've previously done. This is the Ascension Perks tier list. Now, Ascension Perks are a little different than Species Traits and Empire Civics in that you don't have to pick them at the very start of the game. But every game you play, if you have the appropriate Utopia DLC, you will be picking Ascension Perks, and there are some that are better than others. Hence why I decided to come up with this tier list. There's going to be no background gameplay going on in this particular video. I'm just going to be using this stock image in the background. As time goes on, there will be yellow boxes around the particular tier that I'm talking about in the video. Those are to help with navigation, but I'll also be putting timestamps in the description below. Now, before we jump into this tier list, I would like to give one last thank you to Stefan. He has his own YouTube channel, Stefan Anon. He uploads Stellaris PC content, so right now he's been releasing a lot of 2.6 stuff due to Federations being released in the middle of March. However, he has some really good guides that can be useful to getting a leg up and understanding the changes that are coming with Update 2.2 and what you'll need to know to play Stellaris effectively on the console once we get Update 2.2 later on in 2020. Now, I fully expect this tier list to be a lot shorter than the previous tier lists, as there were some 30-odd Empire Civics and traits to talk about, but this tier list only has 20 Ascension Perks. And as you can see, they kind of look like an upside-down pyramid, as it is simply true that there are more good Ascension Perks than bad Ascension Perks. And we'll be going through those in just a moment. So, I have rated the Ascension Perks based on their overall usefulness throughout an entire game. Whether they get better or worse over time, the requirements to unlock them, and their overall positive or negative effects that will impact the player. This is ranking Ascension Perks strictly on the benefits and effects they immediately provide upon unlocking, and do not take into account the 3 Ascension paths. That's a video for another day, which will probably be done after we get 2.2. So, any technologies or special abilities that the Ascension Perks give you, as well as their direct bonuses, is what's being rated. Not, whether or not unlocking a certain Ascension Perk gives you access to another Ascension Perk, namely for the Ascension paths. That is not what is being rated here, and that is why they are kind of skewed the way they are. So please understand that as we get into this. One last thing before we get started, though, if you have not seen them yet, the Species Traits and Empire Civics tier list, I highly recommend giving those a watch before we do this one. As I understand, not everybody has Utopia DLC, so the ability to even unlock Ascension Perks is not available to every Stellaris Console Edition player. And if you do not have Utopia DLC, I'm surprised that you're watching this video. Nonetheless, thank you very much for your time. So, I have split up the Ascension Perks into 6 tiers: S, A, B, C, D, and F tier, with S being the best and F being the worst. So in S tier, we have great Ascension Perks with few or easily attainable requirements, and these see significant usefulness throughout the game. These are top picks for any Empire. A tier. These are very good Ascension Perks for any Empire regardless of build. They provide strong benefits throughout an entire game. They're slightly less useful or have slightly less positive effects than the Ascension Perks in S tier. B tier. These are good Ascension Perks, effective for most Empire builds. They may lack usefulness for certain Empire setups or stages of the game, or are just not as effective as A and S tier Ascension Perks. C tier. These are mediocre Ascension Perks that can be used by most Empire builds, but are generally outclassed by other Ascension Perks in B, A, and S tier, either in all stages of the game or in overall effectiveness. The more niche Ascension Perks fall into this tier and can largely be avoided. D tier. These are bad Ascension Perks that see use but only for specific niche Empire builds. They have temporary usefulness only in specific stages of the game, or have very weak positive effects. F tier. These are bad Ascension Perks that should be avoided and never chosen outside role-playing. They have minimal, zero, or extremely short-term usefulness and very unworthy effects. So pretty much the same reasonings behind the traits and Empire Civics is what went into putting the Ascension Perks here. Similar to Civics, though, Ascension Perks do have requirements, so those were also taken into account, and I will be telling you not just the effects of the Ascension Perk, but also the requirements of each Ascension Perk as well. So we're going to start from the bottom to the top, beginning with F tier. There's only one Ascension Perk here, and it's a Galactic Force Projection. This increases naval capacity by plus 200 and requires 2 other Ascension Perks to be selected beforehand. This is a borderline useless perk due to naval capacity being bugged in Console Edition. The only positive effect is that it helps deter hostile AI empires from attacking the player due to the player having superior or overwhelming naval capacity. Aside from this, it has no benefit. It also gets worse over time, as late game can see massive expansion onto new colonies, resulting in huge increases to naval capacity from having more pops and spaceports. So pretty self-explanatory. Galactic Force Projection on its own would be pretty good if naval capacity actually did something, but right now in Console Edition it doesn't. You can go as high over naval capacity as you want, and your ships do not have increased maintenance costs, so this perk is useless. Picking it strictly to prevent hostile AI empires from attacking you is dumb when you can simply build more ships and get more fleet power, or colonize more worlds to get more naval capacity, or focus on teching up to have superior technologies than they do. Picking this perk is just really, really unintelligent, and I highly recommend against picking it ever. It is used in one planet strategy, but even then, I would say that there is something else that you can pick instead of this one. D tier. There's only 2 in D tier. The first one is Imperial Prerogative. This increases your core sector systems by plus 5. This can be picked really early to help with players who expand to a large amount of colonies without having to use sectors. The usefulness of it drops off in the late game due to traditions and technologies that increase core sector system count, namely the Administrative Efficiency Society repeatable tech. Despite this technology potentially taking a long time to complete, its existence renders this Ascension perk irrelevant. So there's really no reason to ever pick this unless you're just memeing it up with a lot of core sector systems and not having to use any sectors in the early or middle stages of the game. Even then, it's just not a good Ascension perk. I highly recommend not picking it. And the second Ascension perk in D tier is One Vision. This increases Unity output by plus 10% and Governing Ethics Attraction by plus 30%. The increased Unity output is nice, however it sees limited usefulness due to players not requiring any Unity production once all tradition trees are completed. Afterwards, this perk becomes a hindrance because of its significant increase in Governing Ethics Attraction, making it all the more difficult for players to shift from their starting ethics to more beneficial middle or late game ethics. Only Unity Rush builds ought to pick this. As stated, there's no reason to pick this unless you are intentionally rushing Unity to try to get all your traditions and as many Ascension perks as quickly as possible. And once you are done that, this perk is essentially useless and becomes more difficult to use because you're going to have a tougher time shifting away from the ethics that you might have selected to drastically increase your Unity output. For example, you might have been Fanatic Xenophobe Pacifist to do the very common Inward Perfection Agrarian Idol Civic combination, plus this particular Ascension perk to really, really crank up that Unity output and get those traditions and Ascension perks quickly. As soon as that's all done, though, this becomes useless, and it becomes more difficult to shift away from your xenophobia pacifism ethics to adopt something more like militarism or materialism, which could be more useful in the later portions of the game, especially when you start seeing more combat. So, apart from Unity Rush builds, I do not recommend picking this Ascension perk ever. Moving on to C tier, we have Mind Over Matter. This unlocks the telepathy technology. It grants the latent psionic trait to pops, and some leaders adopt the psychic trait. It requires the psi theory technology and one other perk to be selected. The actual effects that this Ascension perk gives are underwhelming. Leaders with the psychic trait are not quite as good as cybernetic leaders overall, as cybernetic leaders tend to have better bonuses for their governors, generals, and admirals. Also, not all leaders even acquire the psychic trait. The latent psionic species trait offers 0 bonuses, and the telepathy technology does absolutely nothing. This perk is still the first step on going the psionic ascension route, so you must pick it if you are planning to do that. Overall, though, in terms of what the player actually gains from this perk, it is very underwhelming. So the notes that I had are pretty self-explanatory. What you actually get from choosing this perk is very little. as opposed to, for example, the flesh is weak, which allows you to turn all of your pops and leaders into cyborgs, giving them all the cybernetic trait, which offers bonuses to a wide variety of things. The psychic trait will only be applied to some leaders, and the actual bonuses that they get is not very great. Higher evasion for your animals, that's okay, but why go for that when you can have better fire rate? The best leaders to get the psychic trait are your scientists, as they have a plus 10% to research speed when they are put in charge of researching technology branches. Next up, we have World Shaper. This increases your terraforming speed by plus 100%, and the player gains the Atmospheric Manipulation Society technology. It requires having the Terrestrial Sculpting Society technology, which is the very first tech being able to allow you to terraform planets. This is a good pick for investing in long-term development, as terraforming becomes more useful going into the late stages of the game. Terraforming is significantly cheaper than constructing a ring world or habitat. You can terraform multiple worlds at the same time, and the technology is available relatively early. This perk is brought down from A tier due to the possibility of players not having adequate terraforming candidates to make use of it, and this perk being rendered moot if the player does not plan to do much, if any, terraforming. I actually dropped this Ascension perk down from the B tier, as terraforming is not viable until the late game due to its costs and resources, and being largely unnecessary until colonizing inwards. And what that means is when you can no longer expand outwards because all of the AI empires or all of the other empires in the game have their borders defined, as do you with your current colonies and your current frontier outposts, and you can no longer expand outwards because all of the territory in the galaxy is claimed. Now you're expanding inwards, which means you need to start colonizing those worlds that you may have passed on earlier because they have too low habitability or other similar reasons. That's when you'll want to start using terraforming to its fullest extent. But until then, this perk is not a terribly good pick. It does give you that pretty handy atmospheric manipulation technology, and you can get this perk early on, but there are definitely better ones to choose over this one. It's more of a long-term investment than anything else. Lastly, in C tier, we have Interstellar Dominion. This increases border range by plus 25%. More border range in the early and middle stages of the game means more star systems that can be exploited for resources. However, as the game progresses into the later stages, borders become more defined by the systems directly controlled via a colony or frontier outpost. Also, larger borders can result in more border friction with AI empires, which can lead to lowered opinions, resulting in weaker diplomacy. This stacks well with adopting the Supremacy Tradition Tree, Galactic Ambitions Society technology, and the Nationalistic Zeal Empire Civic. However, it does lose value over time. So as stated, this is not as good as simply being able to colonize more worlds, being able to build more frontier outposts, etc., etc. As the means to do so, the resources needed to colonize more worlds and build more frontier outposts can be also applied to other uses. Increasing your border range can simply annoy nearby empires more than you. It still has its use in the early game, but I don't really recommend it over other Ascension perks in the higher tiers. Still not a terrible pick. It's a moderately safe one, but you can definitely do better. Moving on to B tier, starting to get in some pretty decent ones. First up, we have Mastery of Nature. This reduces the cost of clearing tile blockers by 100%, and it unlocks the ability to clear most tile blockers without having to colonize new worlds and learn the technology to do so. This perk is a surprisingly good pick to help with a player's early game economy, as most planet-side tile blockers cost no energy or minerals to remove, thus freeing up those resources to be used for more important needs. This also helps players drill down through the Society tech tree, since the relevant technologies for clearing these tile blockers will not appear as research alternatives. The usefulness drops off in the later portions of the game as terraforming becomes a more prominent necessity for making new colonies much more habitable, and terraforming completely removes all tile blockers upon completion. So this perk is actually way more useful in the early and middle stages of the game than World Shaper is, and where terraforming starts to come into play, that's when this perk really starts to drop off, as you're terraforming worlds within your borders that you kind of passed over previously, as well as possibly doing things like constructing habitats and ring worlds. This perk loses its usefulness if you intend and do construct a lot of habitats and don't colonize many planets. So it's still a very good pick. It's a very good, very safe pick. You get a bunch of Technologies for free, sort of. They don't get unlocked. They'll just never appear. And it can save you a lot of resources in the long run, especially if you're playing very wide. So, not a bad pick. I definitely do recommend it, although there are some better ones in my opinion. Next up, we have Consecrated Worlds. This unlocks the Consecrate World Edict, which lasts 100 years and grants plus 10% to happiness, plus 10% to growth speed, and plus 15% unity production. This requires having the spiritualism ethic for your empire in order to unlock this. This is an excellent pick for spiritualist empires at the start of the game, as it helps increase colony development and improves production with both a happiness and a unity bonus. The edict itself lasts an extremely long time and likely won't need to be renewed again once it runs out, unless players intend to keep maximizing unity production as much as possible. The usefulness of this Ascension perk drops off later in the game as new colonies are harder to come by, and the unity bonus becomes obsolete when the player has completed all tradition trees. That plus the restriction to spiritualism stops this perk from being S tier, although players can choose this perk and then switch their governing ethics at any time while still having this perk's benefits. So I actually dropped this down from A tier initially, as the edict is very expensive. So say you have planetary edicts like capacity overload or production targets, which increase energy and minerals production respectively. If those cost 105 influence to enact, Consecrate World costs 210 influence, so it is very expensive. It's not as beneficial for empires that are playing very wide, especially in the early game, because you just won't have the influence to consecrate every new colony that you start to inhabit, every new planet that you start to inhabit. So the overall usefulness of this perk, it does have its use, but it's definitely a lot more limited than some other perks, especially those in A or S tier, but still not a bad pick, especially if you're playing Spiritualist. Okay, Master Builders. This increases megastructure build speed by plus 100%. It requires the Voidborn or Galactic Wonders Ascension perk to already be selected. This is a great perk for players who intend to build megastructures in their empire. However, this perk is entirely useless if players do not opt for megastructures at all for whatever reason, and cannot even be selected if players do not select other perks that allow them to build a megastructure. If a player intends to incorporate the large-scale megastructures in their empire, this perk is pretty much a must-have. However, since its usefulness extends only to megastructures, it is not rated higher. It does help you do things like build habitats and science nexuses and a Sentry Array faster, and it definitely improves the build time for Ring Worlds and Dyson Spheres from about 50 years down to around 25 years. So it does have its use, but if you are not planning on building megastructures at all for whatever reason, maybe you're insane, then this perk is essentially useless and you can't pick it anyways. So if you do intend to build megastructures, and especially if you plan to build lots of them, this is pretty much a must-have. Lastly, in B tier, we have Galactic Contender. This increases damage to fallen empires by plus 33% and damage to awakened empires by plus 33%. This requires having 2 other Ascension perks selected. This is a great pick for taking down sleeping fallen empires or helping combat awakened empires. It does not rank in A tier due to this perk being useless if the player starts a game with 0 fallen empires spawning in the galaxy, and the perk becoming useless once all fallen or awakened empires are defeated. If there are no fallen empires in the galaxy, this perk is a waste. There's definitely better picks if you decide to start the game with 0 fallen empires, and once those fallen empires are taken out of the game, this perk is just taking up a perk slot. So it does have its use for that specific use. It is pretty good, but outside of that use, there's no reason to choose it. And that's why it's down in B tier. Still good for what it does, but not good to be chosen all the time. Moving on up to A tier, starting to get into some really good civics here. First up, Engineered Evolution. This gives you an additional 2 trait points, and the Modify Species Special Project cost is reduced by 50%, and it also unlocks the Gene Seed Purification technology. It requires the Gene Tailoring technology and 1 other Ascension perk to be already selected. The 2 additional trait points allows players to further increase their native species resource production or remove most, if not all, red traits. This also unlocks the Gene Seed Purification Society technology, which gives access to Gene Warrior armies, arguably the best armies in the game. The reduced cost of Modified Species special projects helps players to make their first modifications relatively quickly by the time they have unlocked this perk. The only downside is the required gene tailoring technology can be difficult to appear as a society research option for players. So pretty much as my notes said, it's entirely possible that you have to hold off on picking this one for quite a while because getting the gene tailoring technology can take a while. It has a few requirements. It's a little further down in the society tech tree, but once you get it, you can choose this perk. And having this perk selected does give you some good benefits. It's also the first step on the biological ascension path, but as stated, that's not really being considered here. Next up, we have the flesh is weak, the first step on the synthetic ascension path. This reduces robot maintenance costs by 15% and increases robot build speed by plus 25%. It gives an engineering special project to give species cybernetic implants. It requires the droid's technology and one other perk to be selected already. This perk does very little at first until players complete this special project that turns their species into cyborgs. Cybernetic pops have increased habitability, army damage, and minerals production. Cyborg leaders have very long lifespans and offer good bonuses, especially compared to most psychic leaders. The enhancements to robots also helps players to make better use of robot pops, allowing them to build at faster rates and be more sustainable due to lowered maintenance. This is one of only 2 methods to increase robot build speed, and these effects are immediate upon selecting the perk. This perk's biggest drawback is once the special project is completed, the spiritualist AI empires of the galaxy will have a lowered opinion of the player due to the wicked cyborgs modifier. So as stated, there is a slight drawback to completing the special project. Spiritualist empires will dislike you a little more, making it harder to enact diplomacy with them. Something like research agreements or migration treaties, if you're so interested, they'll be less likely to do so if they already had a fairly neutral opinion of you in particular. Nevertheless, the bonuses that you get from being able to build robots faster, require less energy to maintain them, as well as from your pops all having the cybernetic trait, you get some pretty decent production bonuses, and your leaders get some pretty good bonuses from being cyborgs as well. Okay, the third Ascension perk in A tier is Galactic Wonders. This unlocks the Sentry Array, the Science Nexus, and the Dyson Sphere megastructures. It requires the Mega Engineering technology and 3 other Ascension perks to be selected. This grants access to the specialized megastructures that can help the Empire's economy or strategic planning. This perk is not S tier due to the extreme variations in megastructure usefulness. While the Sentry Array is arguably the best megastructure available on console right now, the Dyson Sphere is objectively the worst. Choosing this perk makes Master Builders a must-have. So as stated, you get access to the Sentry Array, which is probably the best megastructure in console right now. You also get the Science Nexus, which is really good for helping you keep teched up, especially in the later portions of the game with those repeatable, and the Dyson Sphere, which, despite giving you a lot of energy, still takes a very long time to build and requires a lot of minerals to complete it. Once you choose this, you definitely have to choose Master Builders almost right after it, so that you can build those megastructures more quickly. And as stated, the only reason this is an S tier is because it gives you the best, the middle, and and subjectively the worst megastructures in the game. Moving on, we have Transcendence. All pops gain the psionic trait, granting plus 5% science, production, energy, and happiness bonuses. All leaders gain the psychic trait, and this allows the player to breach the shroud for additional bonuses and special psionic technologies. This requires the Mind Over Matter perk and 2 other perks to be selected. Psionic pops have a wide array of bonuses to production, making them versatile workers. Most psychic leaders are not as good as cyborg or synthetic leaders, but scientists still have good bonuses to research and survey speeds. The value in this perk lies in its granting access to the Shroud, where players can acquire additional significant bonuses, as well as powerful, unique psi technologies. This perk is eked out of S tier due to also having the potential to curse the player, giving them harsh penalties. It also makes it difficult to shift ethics away from spiritualism due to researching psionic tech. So as stated, it's not S tier despite doing really good stuff for you, simply because breaching the Shroud can actually screw you over more than really help you. You can get curses, which reduce the productivity and effectiveness of your empire, and you can also activate the End of the Cycle, which is essentially a 4th crisis event that is entirely triggered by the player. Also, by picking this, it's extremely difficult to shift away from spiritualism if you haven't already, because completing those psionic technologies adds more governing ethics attraction to spiritualism. So if you haven't done it by the time you get even the Mind Over Matter Ascension perk, it's very difficult to do so. Nevertheless, this is still a really, really good Ascension perk for what it does for you, and overall, I think the Psionic Ascension path is actually the most unique of the three, so I highly recommend trying it out for yourself. And last, in A tier, we have Synthetic Evolution. This decreases robot maintenance costs by a further minus 25%, increases robot build speed by plus 25%, and gives an engineering special project to turn the entire species into synthetics. This requires the synthetics and synthetic personality matrix technologies, the Flesh is Weak Ascension perk, and 2 other perks to be selected. This perk by itself gives significant bonuses to utilizing robot pops by further reducing their maintenance costs and increasing their build speed even more. Players who opt for this perk will see their robot pops built in 20 months instead of 30, which is faster than most organic pops will ever fully grow. This allows for extremely fast colony development. Once the special project is completed, players also essentially increase all production by at least 20%, except for food and unity, and all leaders will have the synthetic trait offering powerful bonuses. Synthetic pops tend to also be happier, granting further bonuses to resource production. This perk's major flaw is it angers all spiritualist empires in the galaxy with the soulless machine's negative opinion modifier. A spiritualist fallen empire will declare war on players who complete the synthetic ascension. So the only reason that synthetic evolution is not S tier is because of that negative opinion modifier. It's actually bad enough where nearby spiritualist fallen empires will declare war on you. Theoretically, it should only be if a spiritualist fallen empire is close to you, but in my experience, I've had it where a fallen empire halfway across the galaxy was mad enough to repeatedly declare war on me after I uploaded my consciousness into robotic bodies, and it was very annoying. Apart from that, this is a massive uptick in overall production and effectiveness. Synthetic leaders are very powerful. They are immortal as well, so they'll stick around for a very long time if you have a very good one. And synthetic pops are extremely useful. You have no need for food anymore, so you can completely overhaul any food planets that you still have and simply convert them to either science or energy, or more importantly, minerals. And all of your synthetic pops have plus 20% extra production in all 3 of those fields of resource generation. Let's move on. S tier. These are the creme de la creme, the best, the safest, and the most useful Ascension perks in the game right now. Starting off with Technological Ascendancy, this increases research speeds by plus 10%. This is the safest early game perk, which can be chosen by any player regardless of their empire build. This perk's effects will be felt in all stages of the game. Players will unlock the early and middle technologies faster and gain an edge over other early empires, generating anywhere from 50 to 250 additional points of science in the late game. So my blurb about the extra points of science in the late game is essentially this perk adds plus 10% research speed. It essentially generates an additional plus 10% science that your entire empire produces. So if your empire is producing 500 science, having this perk is helping generate an additional 50, as are numerous other ways to increase research speed by an additional 10%. If you're generating a lot of science and you have, say, 2,500 total science being produced, this perk is generating an additional 250 every month. It's a very good pick. It's a very safe pick. It's almost always a no-brainer to go with it whenever you start your game and you get your first Ascension perk available. Next up, we have Voidborn. This unlocks habitat stations. It requires the deep space installations and battleships engineering technologies. This gives you access to habitats, which allows players to construct small colonies in star systems that have no habitable worlds at all, which can help players make necessary increases to production. However, habitats are only useful for producing energy and science in the early and middle stages of the game, with their value as science colonies dropping off later on. They are also incapable of having any planetary modifiers, which on a planetside colony can offer very large bonuses to resource productions. Lastly, due to being a space station, habitats are incapable of having a spaceport, with 2 players controlling an equal amount of colonies. one only colonizing planets and the other using habitats, the player with planetary colonies will have a significant advantage in their ability to construct more ships more quickly. This limited value in resource production and inability to exploit the same benefits as a planetary colony drops the perk down from A tier. So I actually bumped this up from B tier, as the science production gets better as players construct more habitats until later in the game, and habitats are just generally useful when you're in a serious bind. If you find yourself blocked off from hostile empires that have closed their borders, and you have nowhere to expand, and you have very limited habitable worlds, habitat stations will be very useful, period. You can still build them up and tailor them for either food or minerals production, even though they're not as efficient for it as for producing science, or God forbid for producing energy, which they are best at. You can still build some habitats and construct minerals structures on them until you actually find a decent planet to turn into a minerals focused colony, and then you can change all those buildings on your habitat to produce either science or energy, or maybe even food if you really need it. My own personal bias against this particular Ascension perk did not stop me from putting it all the way up to S tier. I don't have as good of a positive relation with this particular Ascension perk, but to be honest, I'm going to have to say that my experience with habitats is a lot less than many other people who play this game. A lot of people swear by it, and it's easy to understand why. It does have its drawbacks, however, being able to expand at will from a very early point in the game, even if you are unable to get to more habitable worlds, it is simply immeasurably beneficial to be able to do that. And habitats are relatively cheap in their overall production cost, and they will finish fairly quickly as well. You can even build multiple habitats at the same time if you feel so inclined. So it's very good to go with habitats. I highly recommend using them as often as possible, and tailor them to whatever you need them to do. Whatever your empire needs, by all means, use your habitats to specifically produce that particular type of resource. So, the third Ascension perk in S tier is the Circle of Life. This unlocks the Ringworld megastructure. It requires the Mega Engineering technology, the Voidborn Ascension perk, and 2 other perks to be selected as well. This perk is rated higher than Voidborn and Galactic Wonders solely because of its versatility. A Ringworld still takes a very long time to finish construction, but only at about half the cost of a Dyson Sphere. Also, Ringworlds can be used for any type of resource production the player sees fit, unlike habitats, which are best for energy and decent to a point for science. Ringworld sections can be specialized to produce large amounts of any resource with almost no penalties, aside from a lack of planetary modifiers. They can also have a spaceport constructed in orbit, meaning a fully realized Ringworld can build 4 ships simultaneously in a single star system. This perk's only drawback is its requirement of choosing Voidborn beforehand. So yeah, Ringworlds are very good. They take an extremely long time to construct, but they take less overall resources than a Dyson Sphere, and upon completion, they'll do more for you than a Dyson Sphere. Yes, you will end up getting higher tradition and science technology costs by fully colonizing a Ringworld compared to, building other megastructures that do not require colonization. However, the amount of resources that can be produced from a fully completed Ringworld is immense. And the best thing, in my opinion, that you can do with a Ringworld is have all 4 sections cranking out minerals. You'll see your overall minerals production go through the roof, and with 4 spaceports, you can quickly build up a decent-sized fleet in this one single star system in a fairly short amount of time. Let's move on. Evolutionary Mastery. Trait points +3. Modify species special project cost is reduced by a further -25%, and this also unlocks the genetic resequencing technology. It requires the targeted gene expressions technology and the engineered evolution ascension perk, plus 2 other ascension perks. Giving players 3 more species trait points can increase resource production, and reducing the cost of the Modify Species Special Project even further to a total of -75% gives players a lot of flexibility in modifying their species yet again. The true gem is the genetic resequencing technology, which allows players to fully gene modify the organic pops in their empire for maximum resource productivity on specialized worlds. Then combined with the addition of the unique traits unlocked by genetic resequencing, this technology technology pushes a player's empire to its limits with the biggest production bonuses available. The only drawback is gene tailoring pops on each specialized colony takes some time and micromanagement, but the gains from doing so heavily overcompensated. So, as stated, there is some micromanagement. Once you complete the genetic resequencing technology, you have to select the specific colonies that are tailored for, say, food production, or energy production, or minerals production, or science production. And you have to do those either in large groups or even one at a time in order to fully maximize the productive output of the resources coming from that planet. So it's a little bit micromanagey, especially compared to synthetic evolution, which is just complete the special project and you're done. Boom, watch your production go through the roof. However, the gains that you get from this, they're huge. Simply put, they're huge. The special traits from the genetic resequencing technology are very useful, namely things like erudite and nerve stapled, as well as if you use those filthy xenopops as food, the delicious trait as well. Completing the biological ascension path is currently the best ascension path in console edition, as you will see the most improvements to production across your entire empire. And lastly, we have Defender of the Galaxy. The damage to all Crisis enemies is increased by plus 50%, and the opinion of AI empires throughout the galaxy goes up by plus 20. This requires 2 other Ascension perks to be selected beforehand. This perk grants the single biggest damage bonus available anywhere else in the game, making the battle against an endgame crisis much easier. It also has the added benefit of a positive opinion modifier, which is an effect that lingers even after a crisis event is defeated. This gives the perk better long-term usefulness over Galactic Contender, as Galactic Contender does nothing for a player once the galaxy no longer has any fallen empires remaining. The lack of requirements, large numbers bonuses, and effective longevity make this perk one of the best in the game. So, as stated, it makes it way better to fight off the endgame crisis. It's pretty much a must-have if you intend to battle the crisis at the end of the game, just whether or not you have already won the game by subjugating everybody or wiping everybody out or forming a large federation that controls most of the galaxy. You pretty much want to pick this Ascension perk. There's not very many that do as much for you as this Ascension perk does in terms of combat, so it's just a good pick all around. And as stated, the AI Empire opinion can be enough to push your relationships with the AI into the positive, opening up diplomacy options that may have been previously unavailable to you, such as research agreements, defensive pacts, or maybe they'll be more amenable to forming a federation. So, that's it for S tier, and that's it for this particular tier list. I would like to thank you very much for sticking around for this long. If you've watched all of my tier list videos, I greatly appreciate it. I cannot stress enough how much fun it was to do these particular types of videos. Once again, I'd like to give a big thank you to Stefan Anon to helping me with organizing these particular tier lists and giving me some additional insight and second opinions while I was making these. So if you'd like to see more Stellaris Console Edition content, please subscribe to the channel and ding my dong so that you can be alerted when I upload new videos. Check out my other playlist. This one is going in the Stellaris Mechanics playlist, which teaches you how to play the game, as well as deep dives into the more nuanced aspects of the game. There's also the Let's Play Stellaris Console, which largely just has videos directly from my live streams, and of course the Stellaris Console Tips and Strategies playlist, which can also help you learn how to do better at the game. Also, check out the links in the description below. Stefan Anon's channel will be in there, and I will also be linking my Twitch channel, which is where I stream Stellaris Console Edition. It'd be very cool for those of you who watch my videos to come by and watch me live stream, typically on Tuesdays and Thursdays. There's also my Twitter feed, which is a great way to keep in touch with me, and I'll post important announcements, such as if I have to postpone or cancel a stream. And lastly, my Discord channel, where we are approaching 100 members, and we have a lot of viewers who came from my Stellaris Console Edition content. Feel free to come by in there, ask questions, chat with other players, even set up multiplayer games, as we have people from both platforms, Xbox One and PS4. Once again, thank you very much for watching this video about Stellaris Console Edition. This is Mobius Y signing off for now.